Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this online talk from the Freer and Sackler, Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art. My name is Joanna Gohmann, and I am a provenance researcher and object historian here at the museum. I would like to wish you a very happy Provenance Research Day, International Day of Provenance Research, excuse me. This day falls on the second Wednesday of April each year. And in this installment of our Tea and Conversation series, we're excited to share with you some fascinating stories about the life history of objects. I have two colleagues joining me today. First, I have Najiba Choudhury, who is a collections information specialist. Najiba, I invite you to turn your camera on so everybody can see you. She is a collection information specialist who is also a provenance researcher at the Freer and Sackler. Her recent projects include research on seizures and liquidation sales in the United States during World War II, and the rise and fall of the art dealer Yamanaka and Company. I'm also joined by Antonietta Catanzariti, who is the Robert and Arlene Kogerd Secretarial Scholar and Assistant Curator for the Ancient Near East at the Freer Sackler. Antonietta received her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley and is an active archaeologist. She's excavated in Italy, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraqi Kurdistan. So welcome to both my colleagues, and I'm so thrilled that you're able to join me here today. So without further ado, let's jump into the program. What is provenance? I'm sure is a burning question for all of you. If I can just advance the slide, there we are. What is provenance? The general definition of provenance is that it is a record of ownership of a work of art or an antique. Here at the Freer and Sackler, we move beyond this definition, though. We like to think of provenance as a biography that documents an object's ongoing existence. It answers such questions that will appear on your screen momentarily that allow us to understand a more dynamic experience of the work of art. It allows us to investigate the people who once owned these objects or claimed ownership of them. It puts objects into motion, and it allows us to think of the different meanings that a work of art accumulates over the course of its lifetime. Provenance studies and research has long focused on the World War II era. As I change the slide, you should see images of Nazi looting. During World War II, across Europe, Nazis looted Jewish art collections, both private citizens and dealers' collections, and also they looted public and state museums across Europe. After the war, there was a big mess that remained, and returning these works of art to their rightful owners has occupied researchers like myself's energies for years. Beyond the World War II situation and the wrongdoings and crimes committed in that context, there are other instances of forced seizures that have occupied researchers' attentions too, including acts of colonial domination and experiences. Now, beyond objects being forcefully taken from owners, there are objects that have been on the open art market, have been gifted, and have circulated free of forced removal. And all of these objects coming from forced removal and friendly exchange all have their own individual stories. These individual stories and histories about their movements around the world are what we refer to as provenance. So the Freer and Sackler is committed to uncovering those stories for every single object within the collection, which numbers to over 40,000 objects. Uncovering these histories is incredibly time-consuming and challenging, as each object requires trips to different archives, conversations with individuals around the world, and different research approaches and methodologies. It's never a straightforward process. And unfortunately, mysteries and questions frequently remain. And it's always evolving. New resources, new materials are continuously coming to light. One of the most obvious places you could find provenance material is on our museum website. Momentarily appearing on your screen will be a screenshot of our collections page. Each object within our museum collection has its own page on the website, and the provenance material appears in a timeline format with each object. Most museums around the world share provenance information in this timeline format, but today we're going to share it in a more narrative exchange. Myself and my two colleagues are each going to share the provenance stories of 3 different objects. Trying to change the slide again. We will be discussing a Chinese jade, a Nepalese drawing, and Egyptian tiles. Each of these objects came into the collection in a different way: a museum purchase, a gift, and as part of the museum's foundational gift. We hope by sharing these provenance histories that you are all able to gain a better sense of what provenance is in general, and also how objects mean different things at different points in time. So I'm going to kick our provenance stories off today by sharing a notched disc likely produced during the Shang Dynasty in China. The story I share with you took me nearly a year to fully piece together, as I had to pursue multiple different sources and lines of inquiry. There it is. I'm going to walk you through the provenance timeline, introducing you to the different individuals who interacted with and claimed ownership of this object. Scholars generally believe that notched discs like this one were ceremonial ritual implements that were buried in graves of important individuals. Unfortunately, the individual with whom this object might have been buried has been one of history's secrets. We do not know the exact find spot of this object either. However, we do know the individual who is likely responsible for putting it into motion on the art market: Orvar Carl Beck. Carl Beck was an engineer who first traveled to China in 1906 as an engineer for a concrete company. He later found employment with a railroad company that was constructing the line between Beijing and Shanghai. Carl Beck first encountered Chinese antiquities when the railroad was being constructed, as objects were accidentally unearthed during the construction process. Through these finds and his own purchases, Carl Beck became enmeshed in the network of Chinese antiquities in China and then also in Europe when he returned. He returned to Sweden in the 1920s and became affiliated with the Museum of Far Eastern Antiquities in Stockholm. And between 1930 and 1934, he organized the Carl Beck Syndicate, which was an organization or a consortium of individuals and museums who would pay Carl Beck to travel to China and make purchases on their behalf. Now, I ask you to remember Carl Beck as I advance in this story to another collector, David V. When the museum acquired the disc in 2017, that is when the Freer and Sackler purchased this disc, we knew without a doubt that the object had been in David V's collection. David V was a famed collector, and he was the president of the Council of the National Museums of France and the Société des Amis du Louvre. Ultimately, he gifted thousands of objects to the Museum of France and financed purchases for the Louvre. He even funded curatorial positions. David V was a prolific collector, and I'm showing you some examples from his collection here. He had 18th and 19th century European paintings and decorative arts, Chinese bronzes, jades and cloisonne, Islamic ceramics, and even pre-Columbian pieces. On our object, you can see a collector's mark, which is a number that a collector applies to the object he or she owns. And our collector, and the number on our object reads DW34/115. This means that it was the 115th object that David V acquired in 1934. My research took me to several David V objects or collection objects, and I compared multiple numbers to ensure that this indeed is the pattern for his collector's marks. Now, 1934 was a very special year for David V and the growth of his Chinese art collection, for it was during this year that he participated in Carl Beck's Syndicate, purchasing Chinese antiquities. Thus, it is quite likely, and we're comfortable as a museum saying this, that he acquired it from Carl Beck. Now, in the summer of 1939, with the French approaching war with Nazi Germany, both the National Museums of France and private collectors like David V began to create and store their collections in the pastoral regions of France to protect them. In August, David V's curator began the lengthy process of packing the majority of his collection, which totaled 152 wooden crates, and each crate was marked with the initials DDW. Now, the curator sent those crates to the south of France and also to the north. And in fact, David V's treasures were stored and protected alongside crates that belonged to the Louvre. In 1941, Nazi officers from the Eisenstadt Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the EER for short, seized David V's collection, and it passed through the Choudhury Museum, which I'm showing you a photograph of right here. The Choudhury acted as a central collecting point for the Nazi regime in Paris, where they would then send the works of art they had stolen back to Germany. It's unclear where in Germany David V's collection ended up, but it surfaced in 1945 at the Munich Central Collecting Point, which was a depot organized by the American Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, which you might be familiar with from George Clooney's movie, The Monuments Men. At this depot, Nazi looted art was sorted and returned to its rightful owners, or where there were efforts made to return it to the rightful owners. Now, David V's curator actually found employment here during the war, after the war, and recognized the same crates that she had packed before France entered the war, and she recognized them as they came into the central collecting point. She coordinated the return to David V, and David V was just so thrilled that he sent, quote, fine French wine and champagne for all the monuments men to celebrate their impending return. So the majority of David V's collection made it back to him by 1947. The notched disc stayed within David V's collection until his death in 1952, upon which time his descendants inherited it. It wasn't until 2015 that this disc was back on the art market. His descendants, David V's descendants that is, decided to sell and hosted a public auction at Sotheby's. At this auction, the contemporary dealer Eskenazi Limited, who specializes in Chinese, quote, Chinese and Oriental fine art in Mayfair in London, they purchased the object at this sale. And as is customary, The dealership, Eskenazi, placed their dealer number and inventory number on the surface of the object to keep track of it within their stock. The Freer Gallery of Art purchased it in 2017 using funds from the Charles Lang Freer Endowment, the Lois S. Raffling, and the Sylvia and Alexander Hassan Family Foundation. The piece has become a touchstone within the museum's collection of Chinese jades, which is one of the finest outside China. In our museum, it serves as an educational tool in telling the story of ancient China. And when we reopen, we hope that you all can come to our museum and discover it in the Freer corridor. As a concluding part of visualizing this object's journey, I'd like to share with you a map charting its path from China to Sweden, from Sweden then on to France, to Germany during the war, back to France after the war, and on to auction in London, and then purchased by the dealer, and then finally to Washington, D.C., where it remains today. Something that amazes me about this object and its lengthy journey around the world, it remains in nearly pristine condition. And also the traces on it, including David V's collector's number and the Eskenazi dealer sticker. It helps us understand its journey, and it embodies those stories of the individuals who encountered it. As a closing note on this, I'd like to say that its meaning and its biography, this object's meaning and biography is still evolving as it plays a continuous and ongoing role in our Smithsonian institution. I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague, Najiba Choudhury, who will be sharing the provenance story of a 20th century Nepalese drawing. I hope you enjoy the provenance story of this next piece, which is quite different from the one I just shared with you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this program today to celebrate the International Day of Provenance Research. Now imagine that you are in Washington, D.C. You're walking up the steps of the Freer and Sackler galleries. Let's say you are in the Freer and you walk down the grand staircase. See the large painting by Thayer of his 3 children titled A Virgin. And then downstairs, entering the Sackler gallery, you might see some ancient Near Eastern vessels, perhaps the Silver Rhyton. Then to your immediate right, you see the gift shop. And directly across from you are these purple-colored gallery space. Maybe you hear some gentle sounds of people chanting and praying at a distance. You have just entered the exhibition Encountering the Buddha, Art and Practice Across Asia. In this gallery, you may come across a colossal Buddha head, the colorful Tibetan shrine, a Chinese stone stele of the Buddha. But what is difficult to miss here is this beautiful large-scale drawing of the Buddhist deity Maitreya. This drawing is larger than life. It is 11.5 feet high and 6.5 feet wide. It depicts Maitreya as he sits and waits for his turn to be born on earth as the next future Buddha. So what's the story behind this drawing? And how did it get here? Who were involved in the making of this drawing and preserving it and bringing it to the museum's collection? This is what we will explore in the next few minutes as we take a trip back through time and space. So from 2021 in Washington, D.C., let us now travel to Nepal in the subcontinent of South Asia. The year now is 1950. It is the city of Patan, a historic city in the Lalitpur district near the capital, Kathmandu. Patan is known for its temples and historic sites, but is also renowned for its artisans who are woodworkers and metalworkers. Among them is the Nepali artist Kuber Singh Shakya, who in the year 1950 is around 69 years of age. He comes from a family who was well regarded for their metalwork and whose lineage can be traced back to the mid-1500s. Kubir Singh is particularly well known for specializing in the technique of repoussé. The repoussé technique refers to hammering the metal from the back to create shape. In the early 1950s, Kubir Singh is commissioned by the neighboring country, the Kingdom of Bhutan, to create a large-scale Buddhist sculpture of Maitreya for the royal monastery at Trongsa Dzong in central Bhutan. The commission came from the King of Bhutan. At that age, Kubir Singh would sometimes work with his sons, Rudraraj and Keshraj Shakya. They would often work from their workshop in Patan, but travel during the installation of these sculptures. Kubir Singh sometimes produced the drawings, such as the one that is now at the Sackler Gallery. According to researchers in this field, these drawings were not necessary, but sometimes requested by the individuals who commissioned the sculptures. The drawings were not consecrated, and thus were not imbued with any religious significance or religious power. The drawing that you see here was likely made by Kubir Singh for the royal monastery of Trongsa Dzong in Bhutan, like I mentioned, for the sculpture of Maitreya. Oops. Now let us go to the year 1997. Can I have the next slide? Oh, I got it. In 1997, Mary Shepard Slusser, who was a research associate at the Freer and Sackler and published and exhibited widely on Nepali art, in 1997, she visited the descendants of Kubir Singh Shakya, including his son, Rudraraj, in their family home in Patan, Nepal. Mary Slusser noticed this drawing in the family's home, and it was stored on top of a cabinet in the family's workshop for many years by that point. The drawing had holes in them due to insect manifestation, and there were some damages to the paper as well. It was no longer being used by the family, as it was a preparatory drawing for the 1950s Maitreya sculpture. Mary Slusser was able to convince Kubir Singh's son, Rudraraj, and his family about the importance of preserving this drawing. And it is only one of 5 drawings that survived that we know Kubir Singh Shakya produced. So Kubir Singh's descendants, including his son Rudraraj, recognized the importance of having this drawing in the collection of a national museum in Washington, D.C. In December of 1997, Mary Slusser hand-carried the drawing on the airplane from Nepal to Washington, D.C. Rudraraj and his family formally donated the drawing to the museum. Now, it's one of the misconceptions about collecting at the Freer Sackler is that museums only collect old things. This drawing was made in the early 1950s, and it's a wonderful example that shows that not everything in the collection are antiquities. According to Nepal's antiquity laws, for an object to be considered an antiquity, it must be 100 years old or older. This drawing is around 70 years old now, and when it was acquired into the collection, it was around 50 years old. Something else that I want to point out about this drawing is that in South Asian art, oftentimes the artists are unnamed or left forgotten. But in this case, we know exactly who produced this drawing and for what purpose. Kubir Singh Shakya's descendants, Rudraraj and his son and other family members, continue to practice this traditional form of art making. On your left is a photo of Rudraraj and members of his family in 2011 at their art studio in Patan. And it's this gentleman here who's Rudraraj. And on the right is a photo of Kubir Singh Shakya's grandson to your right, and his name is Rabindra Shakya, and he still continues to practice this traditional form of art making in his studio in Patan. The drawing's presence in the Freer and Sackler galleries not only speaks as a testament to Kubir Singh Shakya's legacy and the legacy of Newari artists who have practiced traditional forms of art making, but it's also a powerful reminder that this is a living tradition, that Kubir Singh's own descendants are practitioners of this art and is keeping the tradition of making copper repoussé images of religious art alive in Nepal. This drawing helps bring attention to the living artists who continue to practice these traditional art forms. At the same time, it's also a powerful symbol of Mary Slessor's own lifelong pursuit to research and publish on Nepali art, and her tireless work to bring attention to the cultural heritage of Nepal. And Mary Slessor's work is continuing by having this drawing in our collection and having it displayed in the galleries. In October 2017, this drawing was mounted, and since then it has been on display in the museum in Encountering the Buddha exhibition. Now, Antonietta is gonna give her presentation.
This presentation aims to highlight some of the steps adopted to reconstruct the history of a set of tiles that Charles Lang Freer acquired in Egypt. These objects were deprived of any information on their provenance, with the exception of the knowledge that these items were shipped from Egypt to the United States in 1907. This research began by looking into museum collections that have similar objects, exploring publications that provide information on this class of tiles, and finally, delving into the archival documentation available to cross-check information provided by the other museums. Following this framework, I shall first contextualize the Egyptian collection at the Freer Gallery. Freer visited Egypt 3 times between 1906 and 1909. These were stops that he made on his route to Europe or East Asia. In these years, he purchased several pieces, the majority of which consisted in beads. In this slide, you can see a few examples of the items that he acquired. Yet, what makes this collection particularly interesting is the story that links several of these objects to Freer and his interest in collecting Egyptian art. Freer is known for being mainly a collector of East Asian art, yet he found Egyptian art interesting, as stated in this letter. It was his, and I quote, desire to study and compare this piece with Chinese and Japan paintings and sculpture. I now think it surpasses either, but I'm not sure. Study alone can finally convince, end quote. Although the shipment of these objects from Egypt to the States was troublesome, it was also of no bother, as these items were essential for his studies. In addition, thanks to my colleagues at the library, I learned that Freer kept a ledger of his books. And as I was looking at the extensive list of books that he owned, I was struck by the number that specialized in ancient Egypt. Not surprisingly, as Freer lived in a period that saw the development of field Egyptology, his book collection included field reports and resources on the archaeology of ancient Egypt. He brought from these books, and he brought some of these books with him on his trip to Egypt, as shown in this archival document. For example, James Henry Breasted, A History of Egypt, and other books which he purchased on his trip, including Peter Flinder's Egyptian Decorative Art and 10 Years Digging in Egypt. One more book of interest that's not listed among the ones that he brought to Egypt, but one that he owned, is the 1900 work by Henry Wallis, Egyptian Ceramic Art. This was quite an influential book for Freer, as noted already by Gunter in her book, A Collector's Journey. When looking at the Egyptian art that Freer collected, we can find clear parallels or similarities between the objects that he purchased with Wallis' book. These tiles with daisies on the right of the 18th dynasty, for example, could have influenced Freer when collecting rosette tiles of a later period. Or this lotiform cup, which can also be seen in Wallis' book, as also this tile with Rechti bird on the right. When Freer first traveled to Egypt in December 1906, he stayed in the country for 2 months, spending most of his time in Cairo, but also visiting several archaeological sites as seen in this map. While traveling, he met with dealers and collected objects of different types. Among the objects that he acquired or collected, or 49 rosette tiles, along with a recti tile. In a record describing the cases containing the objects purchased and collected in 1906 and 1907, one lot of tiles was shipped to the US. In the pottery list compiled by Freer's assistant, this lot would correspond to the 49 tiles recorded on the right. The pieces were shipped with several ceramic fragments that Freer collected during his stay in Egypt, fragments that were meant to be studied at his return to the United States. The 49 tiles will be the subject of this short presentation, with the goal of retracing their history from Egypt to the Freer Gallery. The tiles in the Freer collection were, according to the records, purchased in 1907 from an unknown dealer, and as established before, have no provenance information. The tiles in the Freer collection were purchased in 1907, and while doing this research, I came aware of an article written by Virginia Webb, who in her detailed research published in Revista del Museo Egizio, looks at 3 rosettes now at the Museum Egizio of Turin. Of interest is one tile with the name Tel Yahudiyeh written on the back side, and a second tile for which the records suggest that it was acquired from the partition of finds from Ernesto Schiaparelli excavation at Heliopolis in 1903 or 1906. A third rosette with a clear, distinct style came from Cantier. Of course, this was an important piece of information, as the style of the tiles in the Egyptian Museum of Turin attributed to Heliopolis and Tel Yahudiyeh was the same as that of the tiles found in the Freer. Freer did not only acquire one type of rosette, but also other tiles of similar composition but different sizes. And this slide is just showing you some of the types that we have from different sides and different patterns. The Freer collection tiles are deprived of any information on the back, as opposed to those from Turin. In fact, the Freer tiles, besides our museum number, have only old stickers with numbers previously assigned by the inventory done by Freer's assistant, or no stickers with number written with what looks like pencil or ink. The tile with the rectibird on the back has the number 1049 matching the Egyptian pottery list prepared by Freer's assistant, another number 1595 with no matching records to Freer catalog system, an Arabic number on the top 0424, and the present Freer Gallery of Art number. Based on Virginia Webb's argument and the presence of similar tiles found in museums around Europe and in the US, I came to support the idea that even the examples at the Freer or the Tel Yahudiyeh tiles. Collections of similar tiles can be found at the Egyptian Museum of Turin, as mentioned earlier, the Louvre Museum in France, the Sheffield Museum, the Petrie Museum, and the British Museum in the UK, the Metropolitan Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, the Oriental Institute of Chicago, the Museum of Fine Arts in the US, and the Royal Ontario Museum in Canada, just to mention a few. The examples from the British Museum, Petrie Museum, Louvre Museum, the Oriental Institute of Chicago, and the Museum of Fine Arts of Boston clearly state that these tiles were excavated at Tel Yahudiyeh. The rosette or tiles that once decorated the palace of Tel Yahudiyeh of Ramses III, the second king of the 20th dynasty and one of the last powerful rulers of the New Kingdom between 1184 and 1153 BCE. Ramses built a palace at Tel Yahudiyeh, a site that has been occupied since at least the Second Intermediate Period. At Tel Yahudiyeh, the German archaeologist Heinrich Bergbey brought to light the remnants of a chamber lined with enamel tiles of the time of Ramses III, and this was scattered around museums in Europe and Egypt. As noted by Neville Edward and Griffith, Bergbey first visited Tel Yahudiyeh in 1870s. His attention to the place has been directed by some very fine enamel tiles and inlay ornaments, which he has purchased from a dealer at Shibin al-Kantir. He brought back from the mound 3,600 discs of various size and gave them to the Bolak Museum in Cairo. Later, in 1887, Neville Edward and Francis Griffith also conducted an excavation at Tel Yehudia. Beatrice Flinders, in 1905 and 1906, excavated Tel Yehudia and uncovered additions of parts to the town made by Ramses III, including a thick mud brick enclosure wall and a palace. The remains of the palace included a large red granite column base, calcite pavement blocks, and remnants of glazed tiles, as well as calcite decorative inlays featuring the cartouche of Ramses III. Scholars have suggested that these tiles might have decorated a palace interior walls, perhaps the private chambers, or even set into mud brick doorframe, cavetto cornices, and throne pedestals. The palace in Tel Yehudia was heavily plundered before, during, and after excavation. Another place attributed to Ramses III is located at Medinet Habu, where similar decorative elements were used to decorate the palace. I am excluding this location at the moment because archival material suggests Tel Yehudia as the source of Freer tiles. In addition to Freer's tile being similar to those of Tel Yehudia, archival research also suggests the same location. Freer was quite careful in documenting his travels, so I looked into Freer archival material to see if I could retrieve some more information on how he came into the possession of the tiles. According to his diary, on December 1906, Freer arrived in Alexandria. In the first weeks, he visited archaeological sites and several antiquarians. He met with two major figures, Ali Arabi and Maurice Nachman, well known in the antiquities market. But he also met with other individuals whose name are not mentioned. He also noted a trip to Heliopolis on December 12 of 1906 and a visit to Shibin al-Kantir, Tel Yehudia, on December 21st, where he met with an antiquarian. Now, if this is correct, we can assume that Freer either purchased the pieces from the antiquarian on the site or from another dealer. What is striking, I believe, is that the German archaeologist Henrik Berfey purchased his tiles at Sabine al-Kantir in 1870s. Although it is quite certain that these tiles derived from Tel Yehudia, another puzzle emerges, that is, who sold the objects to Freer, as Freer doesn't mention the antiquarian's name. In order to look further into this matter, I collected information on the museum that owns similar objects and searched their records for any information available on dealers selling this type of material. In this table, I have attempted to assemble a list of some of the museums that have their collections on an online searchable platform. It is possible that other museums have more of these tiles, but do not have them online or labeled with different names, or the name of collectors or dealers are not available. This table shows in the collector section some of the names of the people that collected these items, and I'm highlighting the name of the dealer that are relevant in this reconstruction. A point of convergence that can be significant in determining who sold the tiles to Freer, or the rosettes from the Oriental Institute of Chicago, where in a publication, Pioneers to the Past, it is noted that the pieces were purchased by Kalabjad Habot and Karpis brothers. In Egypt, the Armenian brothers ran a shop called the Kalebjan Fred, situated in Cairo at Rue El Melingue. It operated roughly from the 1900s. In 1905, they opened a second shop in Paris at 12 Rue de la Paix, a shop that relocated twice in France. Freer mentioned their names in his 1908 diary records when he met with the brothers, not in Egypt, but in France. Yet it is possible that Freer had met them on his trip in 1906-1907, when the records indicate that the rosettes were obtained by Freer from an unknown antiquarian. As seen from this map, the market of such tiles was quite extensive. These tiles can be found in several museums and clearly capture the attention of foreign collectors for their beauty and because of the high ancient Egyptian technical skill exhibited in the production of such tiles. It is possible that making a close examination of similar marks on the back of the tiles found in other museums could help find a seriation number used by the dealer to sell the tiles. At this stage of research, this method has not been successful, as not all the museums provide images of the back of the tiles, and the possibility of visiting storages is limited during this time period. Hopefully, future research could help corroborate my hypothesis. So far, it is possible to suggest that these same tiles collected by Freer were tiles that were deriving from the Ramses III palace at Tel Khoudia. These small tiles showcase a complex history of collecting ancient Egyptian art and highlights the need to shed more light on the network of small dealers whose name are often not noted on collectors' travelogues or documents. And I will conclude here my presentation, but I would also like to thank all my colleagues who provided me with photographs and assistance in getting access to the archival material. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonietta. And to Najiba, I really appreciate you both joining me here today to discuss different objects and their complicated histories. As a point of conclusion, before we open this up to question and answers, I'd like to share some provenance-related resources. You will see them listed on the screen in front of you. Some highlights include our own resources here at the Freer and Sackler Museum, the Art Loss Register, the Nazi-era Provenance Internet Portal, and finally Interpol. My colleagues are placing links to these different resources in the chat area to the side of your screen. So if you are curious, I really do invite you to explore those areas. At this point, I'd like to invite Antonietta and Najiba to come back onto the screen to join me. And I'd like to invite our audience members to ask any questions that they might have. One of our audience members asks, how does provenance influence the present? For example, perhaps in how the art market works today. This audience member notes that provenance very much is about looking backwards, but in what ways can we think about looking forwards with provenance research? I have some ideas, but I'd love to see if we give you the opportunity to jump in too.
Well, I think it's important to contextualize objects also when showing them on display and tell the complex history that these objects have. So as you said, it's not from the past, but it's their present story, where they're found and what are they telling us besides being beautiful objects.
Najiba, do you have thoughts or
thoughts? So the question is whether we're looking into the past, but like, does it?
How can provenance apply or influence the present, perhaps the art? How can provenance research impact the art market, contemporary museum choices even? Right.
I mean, if you think about how things were collected, let's say even like 100 years ago, and compared to the present day, a lot of things have changed. You know, the museum practices have become a lot more stringent and tend to do we do the provenance research before anything new is acquired. Mm-hmm. So that way, things have changed. And like Antonietta mentioned, provenance research is also, even though we're looking to the past, it's very important to contextualize the objects and how they came into the collection and what their uses were. Yeah, and I know, Joe, you have thoughts, so let's hear them.
Sure. So provenance research is really picking up speed, if you will, and it really not only holds the museum accountable for, and when I say picking up speed, I mean globally in the art market practice. But provenance research not only holds the museum accountable to making sure that there is not another rightful owner out there in the world, but it also puts pressure on those who might be doing illegal practices in our contemporary moment, be it illicit trafficking of objects or taking them in an inappropriate and illegal manner. The fact that there are individuals like us performing this research really deters those shady practices. So not only does it impact the art market, it also influences our museological practice as well, in that we are being more thorough in our decisions than perhaps, at the beginning of the 20th century, and even more transparent about the lives of these objects. Yeah. Somebody had also asked if there's ever a concern that items without definite provenance may have had an illicit past or might need to be returned to their owner. And I think that's really at a lot of, that's what really amplified provenance research beginning in the World War II, in regard to the World War II era, in that research needed to be conducted to ensure that these objects that were on the art market and making their ways into museums didn't have, a rightful owner that was connected to a victim of the Holocaust or had been robbed during the Nazi occupation. Did you either have, Antonietta or Najiba, have thoughts on that idea?
Well, the pieces I had discussed entered the collection quite early. And there's the law that entered into practice for the Egyptian collection being exported outside, kicking it around 1920s. This tiles just show, a trend that was happening during that time period. And definitely it's a complex one, but it's also, something that Europeans and US travelers were just like exploring Egypt and, coming to know for Egypt what is the environment there, and, doing what other collectors were doing, like even in the 1970s, say. So it is a complex history. And so I think as long as we tell about it and we know this is how they came about, it's part of a larger history.
Someone has asked about dating of the disc in which I spoke about and how it was dated to the Shang period. Unfortunately, I can't answer that question, as I'm not an expert in Chinese jades, but I'm more than happy to pass that on to my colleague, Keith Wilson, who can answer that for you. If you want to add your email address, I can get back to you on that. Another question, do you get enough time to do your provenance research before a new object is being acquired for the museum? Well, that is part of our due diligence. We do not acquire an object without provenance research being conducted. So that could delay the acquisition, but it is part of the process. We have another question. What role does scientific research play in the provenance research? Najiba or Antonietta, would you like to take that on, or?
I can start just a very small example. So the drawing that I shared today, which was prepared for the Maitreya sculpture in Bhutan. So even for that sculpture, scientific studies can definitely help, because the scholar who did research on that temple area suggested that actually the sculpture is not made of copper. It's not gilded copper, it's actually made of clay. But because no research has been done to confirm that, it complicates the provenance, because it's likely that the drawing that Kubir Singh Shakya produced was for that sculpture. But unless we were able to take samples or do further scientific analysis, it's hard to ascertain whether it is a copper repoussé or wooden sculpture. or not, sorry, not wooden sculpture, clay, made of clay.
Antonietta, do you have anything to add to that idea, or shall I move to another question?
No, I worked on a group of tiles that really Jennifer Webb from the Museum of Turin have done scientific research. So that's the reason why I sort of have that also additional information about our tiles. But generally speaking, some of our objects in our Egyptian collection have been analyzed and studied by our conservation scientific research department.
So we have another question about if a collector wants to donate an item to the museum and it has a questionable provenance, what is the museum's obligation regarding reporting that issue versus the collector's obligation? So that's a very difficult question to really pull apart and answer fully. Najiba, do you want to take a stab at it, or would you like me?
Go ahead.
So once the museum, once our researchers conduct the provenance research, and if we determine that it's just not solid enough, we would graciously thank the collector and provide an explanation, and we would work with them and encourage them to make the proper steps. It really depends on, it's a case-by-case situation, which makes it hard to answer and give you like a 100% this is what would happen, because with each object being so different and with each story being so different. But there would be instances where we would work together and instances where it would be the collector's responsibility. Najiba, would you like to add to that?
No, you covered it.
Let's see. Is this provenance information readily available or generally available to museum goers?
Should I take a stab at it first, and then Joey can go? So yes, so it's on our website. Every object that we have conducted provenance research is available on our collections online page. So if you went on our website and clicked on any of the objects that we discussed, you will have the provenance available there. But also something that we have tried, and our curator, Deborah Diamond for Encountering the Buddha, has tried, is putting stories of these, especially the Maitreya object that I shared, as well as a couple of other objects that are in that exhibition on iPads. So if you were to go into the exhibition right now, even though when the museum would open, you were able to learn a little bit more aside from the wall labels that talks about how an object got there. So that was really our sort of pilot program. And I know a lot of museums in Germany and elsewhere are trying to do more exhibitions that are focused on provenance. So if there's interest, I think it would be wonderful to like expand that in the US.
Yeah, I think you really got that. A lot of these stories too, as this person asks, or do these histories and stories exist mostly just behind the scenes? Yes and no. There's opportunities like this, and then in the exhibitions where we get to share these stories and celebrate them. But one of our resources is we have an ongoing dealer and collectors biography site, which is a way in which we can share the stories of the individuals who really propelled these objects onto the modern art market and put them into circulation, so we can learn stories that way. I see a link to that site has just been added into our chat box. Well, if there are any more questions, this is your last opportunity to drop it into the chat area. I'll give you just another minute, but as we're waiting to see if there's any questions, I would just like to thank both Antonietta and Najiba again for sharing your knowledge and expertise today. And also thank you to all of you for joining us over your lunch hour or wherever you might be, whatever time of the day it is. I hope you discovered something new about the life histories of objects. Now, you can also visit our website, asia.edu, or follow us on social media for more information about upcoming events. I'd just like to say happy International Day of Provenance Research, and thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe, and I can't wait to see you back here in DC when our museum opens. Take care.